In the second video on German Battlecruisers, Grosse Kreuzer, GKs as I call them with the intention of calling them what the Germans called them, we enter into the wartime years of World War I. Similarly to the British Battlecruiser videos, this one will begin with wartime service of the pre-war ships, and then move into the design and some service history of the wartime ships. That being said, I'm going to focus more on the design history here because a lot of the wartime service is very similar to the British ones, considering that British battlecruisers fought the German GKs most of the time. So a lot of this history is going to be basically the same as the British ones. I will start with a slight detour though, from the main focus of the Hochseeflotte. I wanted to try pronouncing that once at least before I swapped to the much easier High Seas Fleet. One of the GKs of the High Seas Fleet was present in Austrian waters at the start of the war, while the remainder were in German territory. That singular GK, SMS Goeben, was the second of the Moltke class. More or less identical to her sister, she certainly had a more interesting service life, even acknowledging Moltke's participation in Jutland. While I will go into far more detail on that subject in her own overview, which is currently intended to be the next in line, I'll at least give a bare overview here. Goeben was, alongside the light cruiser Breslau, part of the German Mediterranean Squadron. All of the German Mediterranean Squadron, actually. Stationed in Austria and Italy because of the Balkan Wars, she was still there, albeit due to be replaced by her sister, when World War I broke out. Unable to return to Germany, and also not inclined to be trapped in the Adriatic, Goeben was ordered to bombard the French and hunt convoys in the Western Mediterranean. In a subversion of the Kaiser's authority, Tirpitz ordered her to Constantinople, technically using the Turkish spelling and pronunciation by this point, but I have no desire to butcher that. Also, it wasn't formally renamed to Istanbul until the 1930s. This order from Tirpitz would lead to a merry chase across the Mediterranean as the British shadowed Goeben, first as a technically neutral power, and then as a hostile power once war was declared. First involving battlecruisers, then armored cruisers, the British would fail at stopping the pair of German ships from reaching the Ottoman Empire. There, in Constantinople, Goeben and Breslau would be transferred to the Ottoman Empire. It is also where she leaves this video, as I am focusing on the service of German ships as German ships. Though, admittedly, considering her crew was just her German one but with added fezzes, one could make an argument she was still technically a German ship. The three remaining pre-war GKs, Von der Tonn, Moltke, and Seydlitz, or Seydlitz, I've seen it pronounced both ways, I just use Seydlitz because it's what I've always used, would end up seeing service that only rarely matched up with the ostensible doctrine they had been developed for. Remember from the previous video here, the Germans intended these ships to be used as a fast wing of their battle fleet, serving, more or less, as fast and light battleships more than oversized cruisers. They were designed with armor and firepower capable of at least competing against battleships, even if they did admittedly lose out on both counts in favor of speed for scouting duties. There is a reason they served as first scouting group in the High Seas Fleet. It is important to note, though, they would not do this duty very often. The one and only time that they really did their intended role was probably the Battle of Jutland. This is in direct contrast to the Royal Navy battlecruisers that did serve in their intended roles. Remember, they kind of swapped doctrines a little bit between the generations. And they did those roles quite often. The far more common role for the GKs, as it turned out, would be operating as, well, honestly, as giant bait. They would consistently be used to bombard the shores of Britain in attempts to draw out portions of the Grand Fleet, for the purpose of luring it to the High Seas Fleet to be destroyed piecemeal. This was rather reflective of the overall doctrine Germany chose, at least on the naval front, in World War I. They wanted to take out the Grand Fleet piecemeal so they could eventually, with superior force, force a battle to break the British blockade of Germany. These raids, while not really what the ships were designed for, did end up fitting them rather well in service. The German GKs were, on average, slower than the British battlecruisers, certainly. But they were still fast and heavily armed and armored ships. Using them for raids on the coast may seem like a waste of their abilities and a waste of coal. But if the Germans used light cruisers for this, they couldn't do any significant damage, and the British could just use their own cruisers to hunt them down. Using the GKs, the British would have to send out heavier forces to try and hunt down these ships. Sending cruisers against them would just end with the cruisers being sunk. So sending GKs in to get in and out quickly and cause enough havoc to draw the Grand Fleet out? Not a terrible idea. At least if the British hadn't already broken German codes within the first year of the war. Because having done so, and not being idiots, the Royal Navy did not often take combat with the German ships. They would try and ambush them as the Germans tried to ambush the British, but these counter ambushes typically didn't lead to much. The notable exceptions here were the First Battle of Dogger Bank and the big one, Jutland. In the former case, the British battlecruisers fought their German GK counterparts directly without any intervention of battleships on either side. That being said, while I will probably do a video on that battle at some point, it was already covered in the Seydlitz video. So for a very bare summary for those who haven't watched that aforesaid video, the British battlecruisers ambushed the German GKs, along with poor unfortunate Blücher, and forced them into a running retreat that saw the Germans lose Blücher, and almost Seydlitz if it weren't for one of her crew being an absolute hero in saving her from a magazine fire. Though due to miscommunications on the British side, they would only sink Blücher. As for Jutland, that's already been covered in the alternate history video, and a bit in the previous GK video, and a bit in the British battlecruiser videos. So for here, it suffices to say that it shows the value of German design practice and doctrine in actual combat. Not been so heavily armored, the German GKs would probably not have come out of that battle, only losing one of their number. And almost losing poor Seydlitz again. The only other major service of note, discounting Goeben's adventures in the Black Sea, would be the odd battle in the Baltic where they supported ground invasions and dueled with rarely Russian ships. Moving on, I want to cover the wartime designs as I did the pre-war designs in the previous video, though a bit more detail as I want this video to focus more on that aspect of them as I said earlier. The first of these, and the only one to be completed, was still technically a pre-war design that was only completed during the war. That was the Derfflinger class, which is something of an interesting one. It follows along with the shift to the Lion class over in the UK in a lot of ways. Some more obvious than others, but the most clearly obvious of these similarities were the shift in gun caliber to a higher caliber than preceding designs, and moving to an all-center-line gun layout. Now, in the first case, this directly correlates to the Lions. Certain members of German design staff had already pushed for higher gun caliber, as I mentioned in the Seydlitz video, but it's one of those things where, absent another Navy forcing the issue, it takes a while to increase gun caliber. There's a lot of cost and lead time in designing the guns, and figuring out how to get them on ships without increasing the displacement too much. Especially when you have someone like Tirpitz in command who was trying to penny pinch as much as possible. He was also convinced that the 28cm, 11-inch gun was still quite effective at the close ranges you would fight in the North Sea. He is not necessarily wrong. Against British battlecruisers, the 11-inch gun was still certainly capable, but the Lions increased their armor along with their firepower. And since GKs were designed to go against battleships, which were increasing armor even more, it ended up becoming important to actually go through with increasing gun caliber. So for Grosse Kreuzer K, what became Derfflinger, There was a couple different options they could have gone through to increase the weapon caliber. The first was a 32 centimeter, roughly 12.6 inch gun. This one didn't really go anywhere, probably due to the complete lack of such a gun even in the design stages. Instead, it was much simpler to just take the same 30.5 centimeter, 12 inch gun that was going onto the König class battleship. This was admittedly still lighter in caliber than the British ships, but in practice it was more than enough to deal with British battlecruisers' armor while still being a threat to British battleships. Though as the British ships continued to grow in armor, that kind of went away. We'll get into that particular issue later. In any case, as I said, this can directly be seen as a relation to the Lions' increase in caliber. The Lions went up in caliber and armor, so the Germans did the same thing. The second direct similarity, the centerline layout, was not, as far as I'm aware, related directly to Lions' design. Because the shift to a centerline layout was something that most navies, barring the ones that were ahead of the times like the Italians or the Austrians or the Russians, were moving towards anyway. It came with the obvious benefit of being able to fire all the guns on a broadside without risking damage to the ship herself, even if there was some admitted sacrifice to all ahead or all astern fire. It also greatly simplified armor layouts without requiring as much displacement because you have less turrets to cover and you don't have to worry about widening your hull out for the wing turrets. Now, I do grant you in previous wing turret layouts you could theoretically fire more guns directly ahead or directly astern. The wing turrets could fire both directly fore or aft, in addition to the "this depends on the ship" single turret forward and 2 turrets aft. This would give 6 guns firing forward or 8 guns firing aft, though in Von der Tann it would have been 6 either direction. Though even here, the best thing for a wing turret, the arc of fire was still limited. Ships need superstructure, and that superstructure would prevent the wing turrets from firing anything but directly fore or directly aft if you want to use every single turret at once. So your theoretical increase in firepower was really only in the case of directly forward or directly backwards. As this was rather inefficient, the shift to a centerline layout was very helpful. You only sacrifice a couple guns while you ensure you always have at least 4 guns pointing in both directions, as well as a completely safe to fire 8-gun broadside. No more damage to your ship's hull from trying to fire your wing turrets directly over it. For similar reasons, the König design did much the same in comparison to the Kaiser class, though the battleship had 5 turrets akin to the British super dreadnoughts at the time. That admittedly lengthy tangent aside, it's possible to argue that Derfflinger's layout was actually superior to Lion's. As mentioned in the British videos, the Lion class and similar Queen Mary had superstructure blocking their amidships turret from firing directly aft, while also still limiting the arc forward as well. Derfflinger lacks this issue because she could fire directly aft quite easily, no superstructure in the way. As for the gap in her turrets, when you look at pictures of it, that's like Tiger and Congo, though to a lesser extent, due to the fact that her turbines were placed directly between her 2 super-firing aft turrets. With those similarities out of the way, I'll give a short overview of the class itself before moving on. Derfflinger was laid down in 1912 alongside her first sister ship, Lützow. These 2 ships were laid down fairly close to one another, but even with that, Lützow had some pretty notable differences in her design from Derfflinger. Perhaps the most obvious of which was her secondary armament layout, where Derfflinger mounted 12 15cm guns and superstructure casemates. Lützow had 14 of them. The reason for this is the largest difference between the nameship and both of her sisters. Derfflinger kind of reverted back to Von der Tann and having a system of roll damping tanks in her design. This was intended to help with her turning ability, but it ended up being, in practice, not very useful. It didn't give enough of an increase in capability to justify the amount of space they took up. As such, that feature was deleted in Lützow and Hindenburg, which again allowed them to have a couple more secondary guns. Otherwise, save for some relatively minor differences I'll go over in a direct overview of the ships, Lützow and Derfflinger were pretty much identical. The final of the three ships, however, is almost the Queen Mary of the bunch. SMS Hindenburg, somewhat special in being named for a man who is very much still alive and in active service, wouldn't be laid down until 1913. Her design was broadly similar to that of Lützow in terms of differences from Derfflinger, with the caveat that there were some discussions that didn't pan out to give her even more 15cm guns. What prevents her here from being considered a half-sister akin to Queen Mary is that the most notable differences from Lützow were relatively minor ones. A slightly longer hull, a different layout, and different individual models of boilers. Those were very real changes, but not enough to be considered a new class. Of these ships, only Derfflinger would see any real lengthy service, though. Hindenburg was delayed by the war to the point she was only finished at the tail end of 1917, with all that implies in regards to service length and seeing battles. Lützow. Due to issues with her power plant, she wouldn't properly enter service until mid-1916, which is when you get into Jutland, which is where she was the only German GK to be sunk in action. She's almost as unfortunate as Blücher in this regard. That being said, while only Derfflinger saw actual lengthy service, the design of her class would prove to be extremely influential in the remaining Imperial German GK designs, at least the ones that actually went anywhere. Of those, the more notable of the two that got any significant work done was the Mackensen class. The only capital ship design to come to mind that was named after a man serving in the military at the time that it was laid down, and in the army for that matter, not even a Navy man. These ships were, well, it is fair to call them enlarged Derfflingers, but also not. The whole form was, indeed, broadly similar, as well as the armor layout. But there were some pretty notable differences, and not just in the increase in firepower. First and foremost, while the ships do look fairly identical at a glance, Mackensen had a flush deck and greater freeboard, which made her a drier ship than the previous GK designs, which tended to have some issues with their stern getting wet in high-speed maneuvers. Another was a bulbous bow, recently been invented in the United States, which makes the German Navy the second Navy in the world to actually adopt such a design feature for a capital ship. A further difference was an enlargement of spaces aft and amidships, which made them better for long-term crew service. I'm sure the average German sailor would have appreciated that had they actually been used in service. A less visible change, though even this could be seen in the larger four-funnel, was a change in power plant. The Mackensens would have had no fewer than 14 more boilers than Derfflinger, 24 coal-fired and 8 oil-fired in all. This was done to compensate for increased displacement in hull form, but also to increase overall speed. While none of the class would ever be completed, so it's hard to say exactly what they would have done, they were at least designed for 28 knots, which continues the trend of gaining about a knot to a knot and a half of speed on German GKs, since Derfflinger was designed for 26.5 knots. While this would have been faster than any previous German GK, it was still slower than contemporary British designs. Though not by much, and for what the Renowns and the pre-redesigned Admiral class gained in speed, they very much lacked in armor. Beyond these features, though, and the general increase in size, there weren't many major differences compared to Derfflinger. At least when you look at the jump between Seydlitz and Derfflinger. A different propeller layout, a different secondary layout, Those are notable differences and do prevent larger Derfflinger from being entirely accurate, but the Mackensens were still more of an evolution than a revolution in terms of ship design. They maintained more or less the same design concept as Derfflinger, but enlarged and changed in some notable ways. The biggest change was the gun caliber increase. It is good to note here the Germans had ideally wanted to jump straight to 38cm, 15-inch guns like on the Bayerns, but this would have led to such an increase in displacement that the ships would have had issues being built in German dockyards, as well as a marked increase in costs at a time when the German treasury was starting to feel a bit strained. As such, while there were multiple designs that were some variation on a renown-ish 6-gun layout, the decision was made to increase caliber to a lesser extent. Instead of 38cm, the Mackensens would be equipped with 35cm, 13.8-inch guns. These were large enough to pose a real threat to British battleships, and certainly the battlecruisers, while not increasing cost and displacement in German GKs by too much of an extent. Even at the time, though, it was recognized as a stopgap measure that would inevitably lead to 38cm guns in the next class. As it turns out, that change would come sooner rather than later. That aside, for now the Mackensens were originally ordered as a 7-ship class. This was a rather optimistic sort of plan considering German resources, monetary and otherwise, though understandable in light of British construction and the acknowledgement that German GKs were intended to serve with the battleships, as well as the need to replace the pre-war GKs eventually. Only 4 of these ships would remain in this class, however. The remaining 3 would become the Ersatz Yorck class. As for the Mackensens, 3 out of 4 would be launched, eventually, though none of them would be completed. The furthest along was still around a year away from completion when the armistice arrived, with the other 2 further behind, and the 4th nowhere near being launched. Even the 3rd Mackensen would not launch until 1920. In this regard, never seeing service life, the Mackensen's most important legacy is in showing what the final German GKs that got close to completion would have looked like. As for the Ersatz Yorcks, a mix of experience from Jutland, turrets being replaced, and the ration of the Lexingtons and Renowns prompted the decision to increase gun caliber early. German designers produced several designs, GKs 1 through 3, that I will go over in the next video, alongside the other GK concepts that never went anywhere, because none of these designs were ever pursued. They only served to demonstrate that it would take far too long to craft and build an entire new design. As well, the material for Ersatz Yorck had already been gathered and the hull laid down. It was well too late to perform any massive redesigns upon this ship, and it would have been a waste to completely scrap all that material and start from scratch. So in lieu of wasting that material, it was instead decided that the last 3 Mackensens would be redesigned and laid down as a new class, equipped with the desired 38cm guns. The primary difference was in those guns, as the overall hull, save some changes to compensate for the larger guns, did not change much. Really, the most notable visible change was using the enlarged hull as an excuse to trunk all the exhaust into one massive funnel. This is the most distinctive feature of the Ersatz Yorck design, and would have served as a fine way to differentiate these 3 from their predecessors had they all been completed. That funnel does serve to disguise, though, that the power plant remained the exact same in terms of power and design as that of the Mackensens. This was expected to, with the increased displacement and change in hull form, lower the speed to 27-ish knots. Again, as none of these ships were completed, it is hard to say what they would have done in actual practice. But with these 3 ships, the story of German GKs ends, for the most part. Only Ersatz Yorck of her class was actually laid down, and the 3 ships were more or less cancelled with the need to focus on U-boat construction and the end of the war. The Treaty of Versailles would put an end to them and any further design studies. Germany would not build another capital ship until the Scharnhorst class in the 1930s. As for the GK design studies, which did continue right up to the end of the war, and the O class because why not, I'll cover those in a third and final video in this series on German battlecruisers. For now, I'll end this video by saying this. German GKs were always a different breed compared to British battlecruisers. Nowhere is this more apparent in that you can see a clear progression in their design process and follow along very easily. Von der Thun into Mackensen is admittedly a quantum leap in capability, but each stage of that process is easy to follow and leads directly into the next step. GKs were always of one concept, a fast wing of the battle fleet that could fight cruisers as well as battleships, even if they admittedly had lighter guns and armor. Changes in caliber of guns, changes in layout, changes in armor protection, none of those ever moved from the core concept. Not even in the final GK series concepts, which were more fast battleships than any sort of cruiser. It's interesting to compare, really, when one thinks of how many different stages British battlecruisers went through and their attempts to counter the German GKs. Watching the video, I hope you enjoyed. I know I kind of got a bit rambly here and there, but if you enjoyed the content, please leave a like and subscribe because I am trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. Obligatory shilling aside, I will see you in the next video.